Okay, so hi everyone, and thanks for joining and welcome to the session, The State of SharePoint Security. And in this session, we are going to discuss, obviously, things around SharePoint security, like latest threats and news, and how we can protect our SharePoint, and what is more secure SharePoint on-prem and online. So I will try to cover like both options. So I hope this will be useful for you, and let's begin. So first, let me briefly introduce myself. My name is Ivan Vagunin. I'm a senior software architect at Every and an independent security researcher. I have been working with Microsoft SharePoint and other Microsoft Office technologies for more than 10 years, and I'm Microsoft certified Solutions Master and Certified Information System Security Professional. Well, those are my pages you can see, and you can follow me on Twitter at handle Ivagunin if you want to get in touch and discuss something on SharePoint security and other stuff. All right. So I would like to start the session with a little story, just a little icebreaker. So the story of a failed security audit. So back in time, like a few years back, I had a client and my team was running some legacy solution for the client on the top of SharePoint 2013. And we were supporting this solution, making some small scale development for like a few years. And then client decided to go for an external security audit. So they ordered an audit of solutions that we were supporting from one of well-known consulting companies here in Finland. And of course, like as we are talking about a legacy solution, I was prepared to have some critics because of security of solution, because I knew like there were some like not really good part in the solutions that can be changed, but actually result of that audit I was not prepared for. So let's see what kind of main risk did the auditor pointed out. So this was a kind of statement in a security audit report. It's not exact wording though, but the idea is that what the main risk that auditor pointed out, that farm was so outdated that basically anyone could hack into it. So this kind of statement is nothing I would expect to have in professional like audit report, because of course it makes sense, right, that outdated farm is a real security risk, but in professional report I would expect to see some more exact statement, like for example, attackers could exploit this and that vulnerability which is not patched, and by exploiting it they could get this kind of access to a farm and extract this data and so on. Well, there was nothing like that in that audit report. And in this session, we are going to find out answers to those questions, and we are going to see how we can find out the real state of our SharePoint deployments and our SharePoint solutions. So to cover the state of SharePoint security in this session, we are going through 4 main topics, and first we will check what kind of existing vulnerabilities were ever discovered in SharePoint and how they can be used. Then we will take a brief look at SharePoint security model to see how those known vulnerabilities can undermine security of SharePoint, and we will go through some real-world exploitations that did happen, and we'll see what we can learn from those. And last but not least, we will discuss some mitigations, what we can do to prevent those attacks in our SharePoint farm, how we can stop attackers from stealing our data. All right. So first thing, when we talk about security of a product, like Microsoft SharePoint in our case, first thing we may refer to is CVs. And if you're not familiar with this term, CVs stand for common vulnerabilities and exposures. And practically it means that someone has discovered a security issue in a product, and this became known to product developer, and they have fixed this issue, and they released the security fix and some description of this issue. And there are few CV database available online, but as we talk about Microsoft's product SharePoint, we will refer to Microsoft Secure Response Center portal. So if you did not ever browse to this Microsoft Secure Response portal, you probably should. And on this portal, you can find information about all vulnerabilities discovered for Microsoft products since 2016. And for some reason, there is no data available prior to 2016. But it's probably okay for our case because we are going to discuss just latest news. So on portal, you will be able to find information like you can see here on the slide. It will have a description of vulnerability. It will have some metadata regarding that, like severity, affected products, affected, and of course links to security patches itself. For example, here you can see that some description for CV 2020-0920, which I discovered it was patched in April. But the thing to notice here, the description, it does not really make a lot of sense. And probably by reading description, you won't be able to understand if this vulnerability is applicable to your farm or not. Because, for example, this one says that exploitation requires that user uploads a special crafted application package to SharePoint. And I can tell you that for this exploitation, you don't need to upload any application package in sense of SharePoint application package, and you don't need to have app management installed. And so this is totally not accurate. What makes sense about vulnerability description in this portal is that it's the metadata, and the portal has API, so we can scrape all the data and we can check metadata like assigned severities and categories to vulnerabilities. So did I, and let's see what kind of vulnerabilities were discovered for SharePoint. So this is the whole picture, high-level picture of vulnerabilities for SharePoint since 2016 till now. And first, if we break down by product name, we can see that it does not get a lot of insights because data here on the first glance, it does not make much sense, and Microsoft doesn't have like a strict naming conventions, which makes it a bit worse here. And on the first glance, we may think that SharePoint Online is like a totally secure because there are so little vulnerabilities for this one, and SharePoint 16 is like way less secure, and 19 is like half more secure than 2016. But I have a theory why this data look like that. And first, we should remember that data come only from 2016. And I think that most vulnerabilities discovered in early versions of SharePoint, like 2013, for example, they were inherited in later versions, like 19. So we can see like exactly the same amount of vulnerabilities here. And like after vulnerabilities were fixed in 2016, they are not like applicable to 2019. So here we have a less amount of vulnerabilities for 2019, but it does not mean that 2019 is like twice as secure as 2016, obviously. So latest patch of each version, they should have like same level of security. If we check by severity of issues, we can see that most of issues are either important or critical, and there's just a little amount of moderate ones. I think, again, it may be not like a really accurate representation of real world, because maybe security researchers, they just don't like to report moderate ones because obviously they're not that valuable, they don't get that much publicity of those ones. What makes more sense that if we break down by vulnerability type, we can see that like most of them are remote code execution, and we also have a big amount of spoofing and elevation of privilege, some information disclosures. But also from just reading this type, it may not be immediately understandable how those issues can affect SharePoint. So let's try to dig into that. And before we continue, we need to have some common understanding of how SharePoint protects data and how SharePoint security model work. So here we come to a little bit of threat modeling for SharePoint. Just a reminder, on a very high level, threat model for any software system will look like that. We have some bad guys, some actors, and who will try to steal our asset, which in case of SharePoint and many other software systems is data. And in between actor and data, we have a software system which is SharePoint in our case, and SharePoint is supposed to stop attacker from getting to the data they're not supposed to. So let's see in more details how SharePoint is supposed to stop those attackers from getting to data they're not supposed to. So how SharePoint stop unauthorized access and how it does authorize, like valid access to data. So as you may know, SharePoint has quite a sophisticated access like authorization system, the systems that check access to data. And access can be granted at many different levels and scopes. And to each scope, you can grant different kind of privilege. So if we start from the very bottom, in SharePoint, you will be able to grant access to a very small pieces of information like items, then comes folders, lists, and so on. We come to the web level, and for each of those scopes, we can get different kind of privilege. And if we go up, we will have a site collection admin who will have access to all data in site collection. And on the top of that, we have a tenant administrator, and tenant administrator manages multiple site collection and basically have access to inside our tenant. If we speak, for example, of multi-tenant farm like SharePoint Online. And the highest privilege you can get in SharePoint is farm administrator. Well, it's there are some like intermediate level, but the highest one is farm administrator. And privilege of farm administrator, it spans across multiple tenants. So in multi-tenant farm, once again, if we get the farm administrator privileges, we can access data from multiple tenants at once. So now let's think a bit from attacker perspective, because threat modeling is more about thinking from perspective of attacker. If as an attacker, I have an access to some like small scope. For example, I have only access to some public space in my SharePoint site, and I may have like a low privilege in that scope. For example, I am just a reader of a home page for something, so I can just see on that page. And this kind of access for me may be not enough to get to information that I want, because usually confidential information, it is not present on the home page where everyone have access. So in this case, I will try to escalate my privileges to get to the data I want. And there are two ways to escalate privileges in information security. One is called the vertical privilege escalation, which means that I will try to run some action in a scope I am allowed to, but this action is not allowed for my privilege level. For example, as a reader, I will try to execute some actions that is only allowed for site collection admin somehow. And there is another way to escalate, which is called the horizontal privilege escalation. And it means that I will try to jump out of my scope and get data from some other scope where I don't supposed to have any access. For example, if I am tenant in SharePoint Online, I created some tenant for myself, and I can do whatever I want with this tenant. But what I could do as an attacker, I could try to use some vulnerability in my tenant to jump out of scope of my tenant, so bypass this tenant partition in SharePoint and get data from another tenant. All right, so this is how vertical or horizontal privilege escalation works. But obviously, to escalate in any direction, vertical or horizontal, I would need to exploit some vulnerability, because this is that something that normally should not happen because the readers are not supposed to run actions for site collection admins, and obviously tenants are not supposed to access data of other tenants. So let's now see what kind of security vulnerabilities I could exploit to escalate my privileges. And I will cover just a few, so it's not a full list of vulnerabilities I will cover in this session. I will make just an example which I think could be like most applicable to SharePoint. So first one is cross-site scripting. Cross-site scripting is a well-known web attack which have been around for a long time. And obviously SharePoint has a web interface which exposes a lot of data. Cross-site scripting is also applicable to SharePoint as well. But luckily, as cross-site scripting is a well-known web attack, there are a lot of mitigations against that kind of attack. And before we speak about mitigations, let me just quickly recap. If you're not familiar with what site scripting is, in site scripting, cross-site scripting attacker will try to execute some script in the context of another user to get access to the data that user owns. So it's an example of horizontal privilege escalation attack. For example, in SharePoint, I can inject some JavaScript to a web page and wait while user with some high privilege, like administrator, visits that page, and then I can run JavaScript in context of administrator and get data that I don't have access to. Well, mitigations against the cross-site scripting that are already in place in SharePoint is first, there is a well-known mitigation against cross-site scripting that is called same origin policy, and it is implemented by all browsers, and it means that script running in some origin, and here origin means that it's a combination of protocol, hostname, and port number. Script running in one origin, they are not allowed to mess with data in another origin. SharePoint, for example, SharePoint Online, it implements few origins to isolate data, and first origin is our main tenant site collection, which is tenantname.sharepoint.com. Then we will have a my sites, which is a dedicated origin, and we will have a tenant admin. And this is done so that if you inject a script to your my site, your JavaScript to your my site, which you can obviously do because you're usually a site collection admin of your own my site, that script, it will not be able to access, for example, tenant admin site and grant you tenant admin access. Then, if we speak about persistent cross-site scripting, which will make this attack like a bit more exploitable, it will likely require you to have some higher privilege in SharePoint. So to inject a JavaScript in SharePoint page, you normally would have permissions higher than contributor. It will be either designer or site owner, because the contributors are also not allowed, normally not allowed to inject JavaScript in a page. So unless attacker finds some clever way to escalate permissions vertically and inject JavaScript with low permissions like a reader, one good mitigation is to just keep user permissions to minimal. So untrusted users should not be able to edit SharePoint pages and inject the JavaScript to the web pages. And also this kind of attack, it can most likely elevate only as high as site collection admin, because as I mentioned, the tenant admin permissions, they can be only granted in context of tenant admin site, and tenant admin site is a separate origin, so cross-site scripting cannot bypass this restriction probably. And also, if you are not browsing web pages with some powerful accounts, like for example farm admin, so which you should not really be doing, because powerful accounts like farm admins, they are for some maintenance tasks, they're not for everyday browsing. So in this case, JavaScript running on your SharePoint page, they cannot get that high privileges. So this kind of attack, it have really, in my opinion, like a limited attack surface. So next one we are going to cover is security feature bypass. Oh, sorry, I forgot to mention here, because on this diagram you cannot see any attacks attributed as cross-site scripting directly, but I think Microsoft attributes them as either spoofing or elevation of privilege. And if you read inside descriptions of vulnerabilities, you can find that there are quite a lot of cross-site scripting vulnerabilities getting reported to SharePoint. Next is security feature bypass. On this diagram, we can see that there is just a small amount of that kind of vulnerabilities getting reported. Those may be particularly interesting one. First thing, its name does not say a lot, it's just bypass of some security feature, but it means that the attacker can really just skip some permission check or whatever and execute some action in the scope they were not supposed to. But the scope of this action, it always depends. And here I can tell you like one example I discovered in SharePoint Online a few years back. And the issue was that the user could actually install an application add-in on their My site. And for the, after they installed application, they could grant this application tenant admin permissions without being tenant admin themselves. So there was obviously some issue with application consent functionality, which allowed like every user who have My site to become a tenant admin. Unfortunately, there is no like bulletproof mitigations against this attack because it's really some bugs in SharePoint, and the best thing you can do in this case is just to update your farm. So if there is some security fix released for security feature bypass, it's hard to say if this one is applicable to your farm or not, but it may be just safer to update in this case. So last one, the type of vulnerability for privilege escalation in SharePoint we are going to cover in this session is remote code execution. As we can see, it's quite a lot of remote code execution vulnerabilities reported for SharePoint. And this type of vulnerability is particularly dangerous, and they are usually attributed as critical by Microsoft Secure Response Center portal. So what this vulnerability means is that user will be able to execute some code on your SharePoint server. It's usually done by sending some special HTTP request to SharePoint web application. And as this request is getting processed by SharePoint, there is some code executed. It's usually executed either in context of SharePoint farm account or SharePoint web application pool account. Also, this kind of vulnerabilities can be used not only to compromise SharePoint, but also to compromise local server. If attacker's code get enough of local privileges, which depends on your particular configuration, how many local privileges does exploited account has. In this case, attacker could try to compromise the whole server and use it as an entry point to your network. We'll see how it works next slide, but just a few mitigations against this type of attack is first to keep privileges of your SharePoint service account as low as possible. So don't grant excessive permissions, don't grant local admin permissions to SharePoint farm account and service account. Another mitigation, it's not that technical, but it's kind of works, because to execute HTTP request to exploit remote code execution, attacker would first need to be authenticated to SharePoint. And because luckily there were no discovered like authenticated RCs for SharePoint. So you may think of just keeping untrusted users off your farm. Because, well, obviously SharePoint is not a platform to build a public facing site where a lot of untrusted users can have access to. SharePoint is a platform for collaboration of trusted coworkers and partners. So just try to keep untrusted users away from your on-prem deployments. Right, so that's, I think, enough of theory that we have. And now we can proceed and see some real-world hacks that were happening for SharePoint in 2019, and we will see what kind of vulnerabilities were exploited in those hacks, how they affected SharePoint, and how they affected those companies. All right. Just a quick sip of coffee. So, sorry. Let's take a quick look at list of most exploited vulnerabilities. For some coincidence, it's also 2016. The article was recently published on 0 Day. There is the URL here. If you're interested, go and read full article. But what have caught my eyes first, that 7 out of 10 most exploited vulnerabilities are for Microsoft products. And of course, it doesn't mean that Microsoft products are not secure and other products are secure. It may be just a state of popularity of these products because Microsoft products are popular and that's why they're getting exploited mostly. But well, let's not dig into that. What we can see here is that finally on this list we can see now SharePoint, and SharePoint made it to this list with CV 2019-604. So why this particular CV for SharePoint became so popular, what it's about, and how it works? Let's see in the next demo. And actually, here I was going to show you how to exploit this CV. But then I remembered that last year when I was in Paris on SharePoint Saturday, it was still the time when people could travel. What a time. I showed you exploitation of this vulnerability already, and probably I don't have much to add to that. So instead we will look at exploitation of a bit different vulnerabilities that I discovered in SharePoint. It's 952. And we will compare how those vulnerabilities compare to each other. Why 604 is getting more exploited than my one. Let's see. So let me share my screen. Share desktop. Here, so just a quick recap about 0604. It's a report called execution vulnerability in SharePoint, and it underneath exploits a well-known issue with deserialization of untrusted types in .NET. And the way, as an attacker, I could exploit this vulnerability, I would just send a special web request. So here I have my unpatched farm, and sorry, it's a session. Oh, this one. Then, yeah, and here I have already prepared some web request which contains my payload. And now I will try to execute it. And no, I'm not going to run filter here. I just want to briefly check that the process on the server. So let's take a look here and see that there is no calculators. And if I execute this web request now from another session, from remote session. So once this request is parsed by SharePoint, it should run my payload, and payload will execute a new calculator. And fair enough, now we have this calculator running in the context of application pool account. So that's a brief recap of how that 604 exploitation work. But now let's kill this one and let's see how we could exploit another vulnerability. So things that make 604 so popular, one of the things in my opinion is that it doesn't require you to have any edit permission to the file. It can be exploited by if you just have a normal a reader permissions to some SharePoint website. To exploit 952, you will need to have a higher level of privilege, because the first thing you would need to do, you will need to create a special application page. And here I have my payload application page in here, and this payload will contain a special ASP.NET control object data source, and this object data source control, it's not allowed to be parsed and executed on normal SharePoint pages because it can be used to run code. Like this, I have just set the type name to process and select method to start. And obviously what this control will do when it's getting parsed by ASP.NET Framework, it will start my process, whatever process I specify here. Then what you do, you upload this page to SharePoint. Let's see. And if you try to access this page normally, and it works exactly the same in SharePoint on-prem and online, it will tell you that this type of control is not allowed because it's obviously not safe. But there is a trick that will allow you to parse unsafe pages on unpatched SharePoint farm. And for that, you will need to use the shared overflow form ISPX, and you will need to specify URL to our payload page. So let's try to access. It will say that some error has occurred, but what actually happens that our payload was parsed and it was executed. So let's see in here that we now also have a calculator running, and we refresh it a few times. Now we have a lot of calculators in here. So it works on unpatched farms, and it also executes code in the context of web application pool account, but the difference once again with 604 that it will require me to have contributor permission. So I would first need to upload some page to SharePoint or modify existing page. And this one you cannot do with reader permission. All right. So let's get back to presentation now and see how the CV 0604 was exploited in real world. So first exploitation of that CV, at least the one that we know about, it happened in spring of 2019, and it was hack of Middle East government where hackers exploiting that CV, they first got access to SharePoint, and then they exploiting some all the Windows CVs. They also escalated local privileges, and then they compromised the network. So in this case, we can see that not only SharePoint was not updated, but also Windows infrastructure was not updated, and it allowed attackers actually to compromise like a whole network, not only SharePoint. In this case, so this attack, it was already discussed many times. You can find a lot of articles online about that. If you're interested, go and read. And I had the feeling that this kind of attack should teach us something, for example, to update SharePoint and Windows servers. But obviously it did not teach like all of us, because in July of same year, there was exactly similar attack happening on United Nations SharePoint servers. And in this attack, once again, attackers exploited first unpatched SharePoint server with same vulnerabilities. And from there, they could escalate their privileges to get a domain administrator and compromise network and affecting like thousands of users in that network. So I hope the second hack will at least teach you to update SharePoint servers. And if you did not update since spring 2019, it will be a really critical thing to do right now. If you run in a SharePoint farm, you should absolutely update, assuming that you can have some untrusted readers in your SharePoint deployment. Because in both cases, I think those sites were kind of public SharePoint site or some public extranet where untrusted users could gain access first. Right, so now let's take a quick look and revisit the defense and the mitigations principles that you would apply to your on-prem deployments. And some of those I already mentioned in the session, but just like let's repeat to make sure we got everything right. So first, mitigation, and I hope I could convince you that this patch management is really important. First mitigation is that you want to keep your patch level up to date. And remember that story of failed audit I told you in the beginning. So few years back, the state of SharePoint security was a bit different because it was almost impossible to find ready-made exploits for SharePoint online. But with CVE 604, it has changed, and now it's really that now anyone can probably do a bit of online searching and find exploits and exploit them against your SharePoint farm, provided that they do have access to SharePoint. So patch management nowadays is really important because there are a lot of critical vulnerabilities getting released for SharePoint almost every month now. For example, in April this year, there were six critical vulnerabilities fixed. So you should have patch management that makes sense if you run an on-prem farm. And patch management for on-prem, of course, it's hard and it's almost impossible to update your farm every month. But you should try to keep up with what's being released on Microsoft Secure Response Center. And if you see some critical vulnerabilities getting fixed, and those vulnerabilities could probably be exploited in your farm, you should patch those as soon as possible. Another thing you could use is always follow least privilege principle, and it applies to both user account and SharePoint service accounts. You should only grant as little permissions to both users and service account as they need to do their work. So don't grant excessive permissions to users, it's obvious. Also, don't grant excessive permissions to SharePoint service account. If you run on-prem farm, don't grant local admin to farm account, don't grant local admin to application pool account. Even if you feel like you have to, it's not the case. And in this case, it will be, in case of remote code execution attack, it will be harder to compromise your infrastructure. Also, and other defense in-depth techniques like network isolation. So if you deploy SharePoint on-prem, you may deploy it in isolated network, so it will be harder to compromise other parts of network in case of someone exploits an issue in SharePoint. If you can, you probably should deploy some intrusion prevention system, firewalls, application firewalls that can stop attacks like cross scripting and, well, things like that. So basically use everything you can to harden the security on the top of SharePoint, because SharePoint itself, it does not provide much to stop those kind of attacks. Right, so now the last question we are going to look into today. So what SharePoint is more secure? Is it on-prem or is it online? And at this point, I can see voices of cloud consultants shouting at me of course, cloud is more secure. But well, the answer is not that straightforward. So to answer this question, let's try to compare risks related to both options side by side. First, if we talk about zero-day attacks, of course, they will be applicable to both options, to on-prem and to online. And if 0 days is something that you are worried about, we have seen that in just 4 years, there were around 400 vulnerabilities 0 days discovered in SharePoint, which were applicable to both environments in most cases, and it makes around one vulnerability, per 3 days. So in case if you are worried about 0 days, so both options are they're not that good. But also on-prem will be vulnerable to end-day attacks. End-day means that there is some amount of time from when a security patch is released before you apply it to your on-prem farm. And this end means amount of days. And this end days, it's really a race between you and attacker. When security patch is released, attacker can reverse engineer it and figure out how to exploit that fixed vulnerability. And for SharePoint, it's really not that hard because most of it is written in .NET, so they can be reversed really quickly and exploits can be made really quickly. So yeah, end-day is applicable to on-prem, but it's never applicable to online because Microsoft, it patches those issues in SharePoint Online before they release security fixes for everyone else. Also, on-prem will be more likely to all kind of misconfigurations, and it's not like Microsoft doesn't make mistakes. Obviously, they also do mistakes, but it's just less likely. And I would consider that general SharePoint online deployment is more secure and more properly configured from security point of view than general on-prem. But on the other side, online will have a wide remote surface attack, because obviously online it can be accessed via internet, and there is nothing you can do about that. Also, you don't have control over who else may have tenant in the same web applications that you do have, and that will expose your tenant to a wide range of cross-tenant attacks, where other tenants in same web applications, they can attack your tenant and try to get data from there. Also, there is nothing you can do from this point of view. On the other hand, in on-prem, you have a total control over exposure of your SharePoint web applications. And for example, you can only grant or you can always only expose your SharePoint to your local network users or only to some trusted partners, and you don't have to, and you should not expose it via internet, obviously. But Microsoft, as a bigger company, they have a better protection and detection tools. So at least for SharePoint Online, I know for sure that they do have intrusion detection system. Not sure, and probably nowadays they also should have some intrusion prevention system. That this kind of technologies they usually will not be available for on-prem. And I know that IDS intrusion detection system for SharePoint Online detects, because I was once detected by that. So I would say that like you should compare risks in both options by yourself. And if you do have a team of skilled SharePoint professionals that can run your on-prem farm and keep it secure like 24/7, a better option would be to go with on-prem. Practically, that is not the case nowadays in many situations, and most likely SharePoint on-prem deployment will be supported by a general IT team, which is not too much into SharePoint itself, just don't know all the like sandbox of that, how to properly configure it. And in this case, of course, you should trust Microsoft to secure your SharePoint better. So just kind of validate, can you run SharePoint security for yourself? And if answer is like you don't know, then probably just go for SharePoint Online. So that would be the answer to this question. But there is no like black and white here. SharePoint Online obviously is not always more secure than on-prem. Right. Well, I think that's kind of all I had to say in this session. If we have any questions, I think I could take them now, or you can follow me on Twitter and you can DM me your questions, and I will be happy to get in touch and discuss those with you, anything around SharePoint security. So, yeah, I think that's it. So do we have any questions? You can try to unmute yourself and we can talk right now.
Thank you very much, Ivan. I have maybe a question about your feeling about the security with SharePoint Online versus on-prem.
Yeah, so my feeling as a security researcher, I would say that SharePoint Online is a multi-tenant farm. By nature, it is less secure by its technical nature because of how tenant partitioning is implemented in SharePoint. Tenant partitioning is implemented on a database layer, and it's kind of called a row partitioning. And there are accounts like a web application pool that will have access to all data in tenants. So that's in theory makes SharePoint Online less secure, but practically I would consider it to be more secure just because Microsoft can take a better maintenance of that and can provide better detection and prevention tools from SharePoint Online exploitation.
Yes.
So,
and we can expect that it's always patch at the best level,
yeah,
and like that.
Yes, that's exactly also another reason that patch level is always up to date, so you don't have to make patch management yourself, which is with on-prem will be a biggest security risk that your farm is outdated.
Yeah,
that's the case.
Okay, thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you.